Hi, everybody. I'm a hot mess. I've been working out in the yard, and I just thought, oh, I better do this so I don't let anybody down. So, if you weren't at our last meetings, we've read 6 through 12, and then we're going to go on to we're going to do 13 and 14 before our next meeting. So, if you haven't been there for the meeting or you want to hear this again, here it is. Okay, so this is. The Tiger Rising, chapter 6. And in your book, chapter 6 starts on, if you wanted to just listen, page 18. Okay, this is a little different because it's an ebook. So, anyway, here we go. Rob floated through the rest of the morning. He went to math class and civics science, his heart light, buoyed by the knowledge that he would never have to come back. At lunch, he sat down on the benches of the breezeway. He did not go into the lunchroom. Norton and Billy Threemonger were there, and nothing had tasted good to him since his mother died, especially not the food at the school. It was worse than the food his father tried to cook. He sat on the bench and unfolded his drawing of the tiger, and his fingers itched to start making it into wood. He was sitting like that, swinging his legs, studying the drawing, when he heard shouting and a high-pitched buzz of excitement like crickets the kids made when something was happening. He stayed where he was. In a minute, the faded red double doors of the lunchroom swung open, and Sistine Bailey came marching through them, her head held high. Behind her was a whole group of kids, and just when Sistine noticed Rob sitting there on the bench, one of the kids threw something at her. Rob couldn't tell what, but it hit her, whatever it was. Run! He wanted to yell at her. Hurry up and run! But he didn't say anything. He knew better than to say anything. He just sat there and stared at Sistine with his mouth open, and she stared back at him. Then she turned and walked back into the group of kids, like somebody walking into the deep water. And suddenly she began swinging with her fists. She was kicking, she was twirling. Then the group of kids closed in around her, and she seemed to disappear. Rob stood up so that he could see her better. He caught sight of her pink dress. It looked all crumpled, like a wadded up tissue. He saw her arms still going like mad. Hey! He shouted, not meaning to. Hey! He shouted again, louder. He moved closer, the drawing of the tiger still in his hand. Leave her alone, he shouted, not believing the words were coming from him. Let me just move my little head out of here. Okay, they heard him, then turned to him. It was quiet for a minute. Who you talking to? A big girl with black hair asked. Yeah, another girl said. Who do you think you're talking to? Go away, Sistine muttered in her gravelly voice. But she didn't look at him. Her yellow hair was stuck to her forehead with sweat. The girl with the black hair pushed up close to him. She shoved him. Leave her alone, Rob said again. You going to make me? The black-haired girl said. They were all looking at him, waiting. Sistine was waiting, too, waiting for him to do something. He looked down at the ground and saw what they had thrown at her. It was an apple. He stared at it for what seemed like a long time, and when he looked back up, they were all still waiting to see what he would do. And so he ran. And after a minute, he could tell that they were running after him. He didn't need to look back to see if they were there. He knew it. He knew the feeling of being chased. He dropped the picture of his tiger and ran full out, pumping his legs and arms hard. They were still behind him. A sudden thrill went through him when he realized that what he was doing was saving Sistine Bailey. Why he would try to save Sistine Bailey, why he would want to save somebody who hated him, he couldn't say. He just ran, and the bell rang before they caught him. He was late for English class because he had to walk from the gym all the way to the front of the school, and he did not know where his drawing of the tiger was. But he still had Mr. Felmer's note in his back pocket, and that was truly mattered to him. The note had proved that he would never have to come back. Wow. Chapter 7. It turned out to be an extraordinary day in almost every way possible. It started with finding the tiger. It ended with Sistine Bailey sitting down next to him on the bus. On the way home from school, her dress was torn and muddied. There were scrapes down her arms, her right arm, and her hair stuck out in 100 different directions. She sat down in an empty seat beside him and stared at him with her black eyes. There isn't any place else to sit, she said to him. This is the last empty seat. Rob shrugged. It's not like I want to sit here, she said. Okay, said Rob, and he shrugged his shoulders again. He hoped that she wasn't going to thank him for saving her. What's your name? She demanded. Rob Horton, he told her. Well, let me tell you something, Rob Horton. You shouldn't run. That's what they want you to do. Run. Rob stared at her with his mouth open. She stared back. I hate it here, she said, looking away from him, her voice even deeper than before. This is a stupid hick town with stupid hick teachers, and nobody in the whole school even knows what the Sistine Chapel is. I know, said Rob. I know what the Sistine Chapel is. Immediately he regretted saying it. It was his policy not to say things, but it was a policy he was having a hard time maintaining around Sistine. I bet, Sistine sneered at him. I bet you know. It's a picture of God making the world, he said. Sistine stared at him hard. She narrowed her small eyes until they almost disappeared. It's in Italy, said Rob. The pictures are painted on the ceiling. They're frescoes. It was as if a magician had cast a spell over him. He opened his mouth, and the words fell out one on top of the other like gold coins. He couldn't stop talking. I don't got to go to school on account of my legs. I got a note that says so. Mr. Felmer, he's the principal. He says the parents are worried that what I got is contagious. That means the other kids can catch it. I know what contagious means, Sistine said. She looked at his legs, and then she did something truly astounding. She closed her eyes, reached out her left hand, and placed it on top of Rob's right leg. Please let me catch it, she whispered. You won't, said Rob, surprised at her hand, how small it was and how warm. It made him think of for a minute, of his mother's hands, tiny and soft. He stopped the thought. It ain't contagious, he told her. Please let me catch it, Sistine whispered again, ignoring him and keeping her right hand on his leg. Please let me catch it so I won't have to go to school. It ain't a disease, said Rob. It's just me. Shut up, Sistine said. She sat up very straight. Her lips moved. The other kids shouted and screamed and laughed and called to each other, but the two of them sat apart from it all, as if their seat was an island in the sea of sweat and exhaust. Sistine opened her eyes. She took her hand away and rubbed it up and down her own legs. You're crazy, said Rob told her. Where do you live? Sistine asked, still rubbing her hand over her legs. In the motel, in the Kentucky Star. You live in a motel? She said, looking up at him. It ain't permanent, he told her. It's just until we get back on our feet. Sistine stared at him. I'll bring you your homework, she said. I'll bring it to you at the motel. I don't want my homework, he told her. So, said Sistine. By then, Norton and Billy Threemonger had spotted them sitting together, and they were moving in. Rob was relieved when the first thump came to the back of his head, because it meant that he wouldn't have to talk to Sistine anymore. It meant that he wouldn't end up saying too much or telling her about important things like his mother or the tiger. He was glad almost that Norton and Billy were there to beat him into silence. Chapter 8. His father read the note from the principal, slowly putting his big fingers under the words as if there were bugs he was trying to keep still. When he was finally done, he laid the letter on the table and rubbed his eyes and his fingers and sighed. The rain beat the sad rhythm on the roof of the motel. That stuff ain't nothing anybody else can catch, his father said. I know it, Rob told him. I already told it to the principal once before. I called up there and told him that. Yes, sir, said Rob. His father sighed and stopped rubbing his eyes and looked at Rob. You want to stay home? He asked. Rob nodded. His father sighed. Maybe I'll make an appointment. Get one of them doctors to write down that what you got ain't catching. All right? Yes, sir. But I won't do it for a few days. I'll give you some time off. That would be all right, said Rob. You got to fight them, you know. Them boys. I know you don't want to, but you got to fight them. Else they won't ever leave you alone. Rob nodded. He saw Sistine twirling and punching and kicking, and the vision made him smile. In the meantime, you can help me around here, his father said. Do some of the maintenance man work at the motel. Do some sweeping and cleaning for me. Beauchamp's running me ragged. There ain't enough hours in the day to do everything that man wants done. Now go on and hand me some of that medicine. His father slathered and slapped the fishy-smelling ointment on Rob's legs, and Rob concentrated on holding still. Do you think Beauchamp is the richest man in the world? He asked his father. Nah, his father said. He don't own but this one itty-bitty motel now, and the woods. He just likes to pretend he's rich is all. Why? I was just wondering, said Rob. He was thinking about the tiger pacing back and forth in the cage. He was certain that the tiger belonged to Beauchamp, and wouldn't you have to be the richest man in the world to own a tiger? Rob wanted desperately to go see the tiger again, but he was afraid that he had imagined the whole thing. He was afraid that the tiger might have disappeared with the morning mist. Can I go outside? Rob asked when his father was done. Nah, his father said. I don't want that medicine rained off you. It costs too much. Rob was relieved almost that he had to stay inside. What if he went looking for the tiger and he was not there? Rob's father cooked them macaroni and cheese and a supper on the two-burner hot plate they kept on the table next to the TV. He boiled the macaroni too long. A lot of it stuck on the pan, so there weren't many noodles to go with the powdery cheese. Someday, he told Rob, you and me will have a house with a real stove, and I'll do some good cooking then. This is good, Rob lied. You eat all you want. I ain't that hungry, his father told him. After supper, his father fell asleep on the recliner with his head thrown back and his mouth open. He snored, and his feet, big and crooked toes, jerked and trembled. In between the snores, his stomach growled long and loud, as if he were the hungriest man in the world. Rob sat down on the bed and started to work on a carving the tiger. He had a good piece of maple, and his knife was sharp, and in his mind it could see the tiger clearly, but something different came out of the wood. It wasn't a tiger at all. It was a person with a sharp nose and small eyes and skinny legs, and it wasn't until he started working on the dress that Rob realized he was carving Sistine. He stopped for a minute and held the wood out in front of him and shook his head in wonder. It was just like his mother had always said. You could never tell what would come out of the wood. It did what it wanted, and you just followed. He stayed up late working on the carving, and when he finally fell asleep, he dreamed about the tiger. Only it wasn't in a cage. It was free and running through the woods, and there was something on his back. But Rob couldn't tell what it was. As the tiger got closer and closer, Rob saw that the thing was Sistine in her pink party dress, and she was riding the tiger in his dream. Rob waved to her, and she waved back at him, but she didn't stop. She and the tiger kept going past Rob, deeper and deeper into the woods. That's what my cover has. My cover has the picture of Sistine on the tiger's back. Chapter 9. His father woke up at 5:30 the next morning. Come on, son, he said, shaking Rob's shoulders. Come on, you're a working man now. You got to get up. He took his hand down and stood over Rob for a minute more, and then he left. Rob heard the door of the motel open and squeak heard the door in the room squeak open. He opened his eyes, and the world was dark, and the only light that came was the falling Kentucky star. Rob turned over in bed and pulled back the curtains and looked out the window at the sign. It was like having his own personal shooting star, but he didn't ever make a wish on it. He was afraid that if he started wishing, he might be able to he might not be able to stop. In his suitcase of not thoughts, there was also not wishes. He kept a lid closed on them too. Rob leaned on his elbow and stared at the star and listened to the rain gently drumming its fingers on the roof. There was a warm, glowing kind of feeling in his stomach, feeling that he wasn't used to. It took him a minute to name the tiger. The tiger was out there, and he got out of bed and put on his shorts and his t-shirt. Still hot, his father said. Then Rob stepped out the door, and still raining. Uh-huh, said Rob, rubbing his eyes. Yes, sir. If he don't stop soon, the whole state ain't going to if it don't stop soon, the whole state ain't going to be nothing but one big swamp. That rain don't bother me, Rob muttered. On the day of his mother's funeral, it had been so sunshiny that it hurt his eyes. And after the funeral, he and his father had to stand outside the hot, bright light and shake everybody's hands. Some of the ladies hugged Rob, pulling him to them in jerky, desperate movements, smashing his head in their pillowy chest. If you don't look just like her, they told him, rocking him back and forth and holding on him tight. Or they said, you look like you got your mama's hair, that cobwebby blonde. And they ran their fingers through his hair and patted his head like he was a dog. And every time Rob's father extended his hand to somebody else, Rob saw the ripped place in his suit where it had split open when he slapped Rob to make him stop crying. And it reminded Rob again, do not cry, do not cry. That was what the sun made him think of, the funeral. And so he didn't care if he ever saw the sun again. He didn't care if the whole state turned into a swamp. His father stood up and went back into the motel room and got himself a cup of coffee and brought it back outside. The steam rose off of it and curled into the air. Now that I'm a working man, Rob said shyly, could I drink some coffee? His father smiled. Well, he said, I guess that'd be all right. Rob went inside and poured himself a mug of coffee and brought it back outside and sat down next to his father and sipped it slowly. It tasted hot, dark and bitter. He liked it. All right, his father said after about 10 minutes. It's time to get to work. He stood up and wasn't even 6 o'clock. As they walked together alongside the back of the motel to the maintenance shed, his father started whistling, Mining for Gold. It was a sad song he used to sing with Rob's mother. Her high, sweet voice had gone swooping over his father's deep one, like a small bird flying over a solid world. His father must have remembered, too, because he stopped halfway through the song and shook his head and cursed softly under his breath. Rob let his father walk ahead and slowed down and stared into the woods, wanting to see some small part of the tiger, a flick of his tail or a glow of his eyes, but there was nothing to see except for rain and darkness. Come on, son, his father said, his voice hard, and Rob hurried to catch up. Chapter 10. Rob was sweeping the laundry room when Willie Mae, the Kentucky Star housekeeper, came in and threw herself down in one of the metal chairs that were lined up against the cement block wall. You know what? She said to Rob. No, ma'am, said Rob. I'll tell you what. And Willie Mae, I tell you what, said Willie Mae. She reached up and adjusted the butterfly clip in her hair and her thick black hair. I'd rather be sweeping up after some pigs in a barn than cleaning up after people in this place. Pigs at least give you some respect. Rob leaned on the broom and stared at Willie Mae. He liked looking at her. Her face was smooth and dark like a beautiful piece of wood, and Rob liked her to think that if he had been the one who carved Willie Mae, he would have made her just as the way she was, with her long nose and tight cheekbones and slanted eyes. "What you staring at?" Willie Mae asked. Her eyes narrowed. "What you doing out of school?" Rob shrugged. "I don't know," he said. "What do you mean you don't know?" Rob shrugged again. "Don't be moving your shoulders up and down in front of me, acting like some skinny old bird trying to fly away. You want to end up cleaning motel rooms for a living?" Rob shook his head. "That's right. Ain't nobody want this job. I'm the only fool Beauchamp can pay to do it. You gotta stay in school," she said, "else you'll end up like me." She shook her head and reached into her pocket of her dress and pulled out a single cigarette and 2 sticks of 8-ball licorice gum. She put one piece of gum in her mouth and handed the other to Rob, lit her cigarette, and leaned back in the chair and closed her eyes. "Now," she said, the scent of the smoke and licorice slowly filled the laundry room. "Go on and tell me why you ain't at school." "On account of my legs being all broke out," said Rob. Willie Mae opened her eyes and looked over at the top of her glasses at Rob's legs. She said after a minute. "How long you had that?" "About 6 months," said Rob. "I can tell you how to cure that," said Willie Mae, pointing with her cigarette at his legs. "I can tell you right now. Don't need to go to no doctor." "Huh?" said Rob. He stopped chewing his gum and held his breath. What if Willie Mae healed him and then he had to go back to school? "Sadness," said Willie Mae, closing her eyes and nodding at him. "You keeping all that sadness down low in your legs. You not letting it get out of your heart where it belongs. You got to let the sadness rise on up." "Oh," said Rob. He let his breath out. He was relieved Willie Mae was wrong. She couldn't cure him. "That principal thinks it's contagious," he said. "Man ain't got no sense," Willie Mae said. "He got lots of certificates," Rob offered. "They are all framed and hung up on his wall. I bet he ain't got one. He ain't got, sorry, I bet he ain't got no certificate for sense, though," said Willie Mae darkly. She rose up out of her chair and stretched. "I got to clean some rooms," she said. "You ain't going to forget what I told you about them legs, are you?" "No, ma'am," said Rob. What I'd tell you, uh, what I'd tell you then," she said, towering over him. Willie Mae was tall and the tallest person Rob had ever seen. "To let the sadness rise," Rob said, and repeated the words as if they were part of a poem. He gave them a certain rhythm, the same way Willie Mae had when she said them. "That's right," said Willie Mae. "You got to let the sadness rise on up." She left the room with a swirl of licorice and smoke. After she was gone, Rob wished that he had told her about the tiger. He felt a sudden desperate need to tell somebody who wouldn't doubt him, somebody who was capable of believing in tigers. All right. Chapter 11. That afternoon, Rob went out to the front of Kentucky Star, weeding between cracks and sidewalks. When the school bus rumbled up, "Hey!" he heard Norton Thurrymonger yell. Rob didn't look up. He concentrated on the weeds. "Hey, disease boy!" Norton shouted. We know what you got. It's called leprosy." "Yeah," Billy shouted, "leprosy. All of your body parts are going to fall off." "They're going to rot off," Norton yelled. "Oh, yeah," Billy screamed. "That's what I meant. Rot. They're going to rot off." Rob stared at the sidewalk and imagined the tiger eating Norton and Billy Threemonger and then spitting out their bones. Hey, Norton shouted, here comes your girlfriend, disease boy. The bus coughed and sputtered and finally roared away. Rob looked up and Sistine was walking toward him. She was wearing a lime green dress. As she got closer, he could see that it was torn and dirty. I brought your homework, she said. She held out a red notebook stuffed with full of papers. The knuckles on her hand were bleeding. Thank you, said Rob. He took the notebook. He was determined to say nothing else. Say nothing else. Let's see. So I'm sorry, you guys. Nothing else to her. He was determined to keep his words inside himself, where they belonged. Sistine stared past him at the motel. It was an ugly two-story building, squat and small, composed entirely of cement blocks, and doors of each room were painted a different color, pink or blue or green, and there was a chair painted the matching color sitting in front of each door. Why is this place called the Kentucky Star? Sistine asked. Because, said Rob. It was the shortest answer he could think of. Because why? She asked. Rob sighed. Because Beauchamp, the man who owns it, he had a horse called the Kentucky Star. Well, said Sistine, it's a stupid name for a hotel in Florida. Rob shrugged. He stared at the rain. It started to rain, and Sistine stood in front of him and continued to stare. She looked at the motel and then over at the blinking Kentucky Star sign, and then she looked back at him as if it was all a math equation she was trying to make come out right in her head. The rain made her hair stick on her scalp. It made her dress droopy. Rob looked at her small pinched face and her bleeding knuckles and her dark eyes, and he felt something inside him open up. It was the same way he felt when he picked up a piece of wood and started working on it, not knowing what it would be, and then watching it turn into something he recognized. He took a breath and opened his mouth and let the words fall out. I know where there's a tiger. Sistine stood in the drizzly rain and stared at him, her eyes black and fierce. She didn't say, a real one. She didn't say, are you crazy? She didn't say, you're a big old liar. She said one word, where? And Rob knew then that he had picked the right person to tell. Chapter 12. We got to walk through the woods, Rob said. He looked doubtfully at Sistine's dress and the shiny black shoes. You can give me some of your clothes to wear, she told him. I hate this dress anyway. And so he took her to the motel room, and there Sistine stood and stared in the unmade beds and the tattered recliner. Her eyes moved over to her father's gun case and then went to the macaroni pan from the night before, still sitting on the hot plate. She looked at it all the same way she looked at the Kentucky Star sign in the motel and him, like she was trying to add it up in her head. Then she saw the carvings, the little wood village of odd things that he had made. He had them all on the TV dinner table tray beside his bed. Oh, she said. Her voice sounded different, lighter. Where did you get those? She went and bent over the tray and studied the carvings, the blue jay and the pine tree and the Kentucky Star sign, and one that he was particularly proud of, his father's right foot. Life size and accurate, right down to the little toe. She picked them up one by one and placed them back down carefully. Where did you get them? She asked again. I made 'em, said Rob. She did not doubt him, as some people would. Instead, she said, Michelangelo, the man who painted the Sistine ceiling. He sculpted, too. You're a sculptor, she said. You're an artist. Nah, said Rob. He shook his head. He felt a hot wave of embarrassment and of joy over him. It lit his rash on fire. He bent and rubbed his hands down his legs, trying to calm down. When he straightened back up, he saw that Sistine had picked up the carving of her. He had left it lying on the bed, intending to work on it again in the evening. He held his breath as she stared at the piece of wood. It looked so much like her, with her skinny legs and the small eyes and defiant stance, and he was certain she would be angry. But once again she surprised him. "Oh," she said in her voice full of wonder, "it's perfect. It's like looking at a little wooden mirror." She stared at it a minute more and then carefully laid it back on its bed. "Give me some clothes," she said, "and we'll go see the tiger." He gave her a pair of pants and a t-shirt and left the room and went outside to wait for her. It was still raining, but not hard. He looked at the falling Kentucky star and thought for a minute about one of the not wishes he had buried deepest, a friend. He stared at the star and felt the hope, the need, the fear course through him of in the hot neon arc. He shook his head. "Nah," he said to the Kentucky star, "nah." And then he sighed and stuck his legs out into the rain, hoping to cool them off, hoping to get some small amount of relief. Okay, anyway, so we're supposed to read chapters 13 and 14 and be ready to start 15 on Friday. So check out my next video. That'll be chapters 13 and 14. Bye!